This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, ideas, and interviews from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Head to mediasalesmastery.com to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I'm your host, Jamie Wood. Our topic this fortnight, the next 10 questions. Now, we have covered the topic of interrogating the brief in the past, but a solid client uncovery is an area that requires constant focus and attention. So we're going to go back and revisit that. Now, whether you're selling media directly to clients or, through an agency, the ability to really understand the client, to really understand their objectives and their drivers by asking interesting, thought-provoking questions that are exciting to answer, it's going to give you a competitive edge. It's incredibly important to be able to do this well. Now, our returning guest is Mr. Wade Kingsley, founder of the Ideas Business. Today's topic, it's an extension of the previous podcast we did, where Wade actually referred to the next 10 questions in the interview. Here's a snippet.
One of the things we kind of work on is asking what we call the next 10 questions. The first 10 questions are going to be the question that every salesperson to every client's going to ask. What's your demo? What's your budget? What's the campaign timing? Blah, 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 blah. And they're all important pieces of information. But the next 10 questions are where you can be really unique and you could pick up a piece of information that the agency or the client is going to go, oh, gee, I hadn't actually thought about that, or, that's a good question. And then you've got a piece of unique information that when you're creating your solution could provide the difference because you've taken the time to ask the right question at the start.
Now, I would definitely recommend going back and listening to that episode as well. It's all around how to sell an idea. But, we did have a number of listeners reach out, post that show, seeking more detail on the next 10 questions and wanting us to unpack it more. So, very delighted to do it. Here it is.
Media Sales Mastery.
Wade, welcome back.
Thank you, Jamie. How are you?
I'm good. We had a good chat before we hit record. You're in hotel quarantine in beautiful Adelaide at the moment. Tell us, what have you been up to in the last couple of weeks and more generally in the Ideas business?
Well, I'm in hotel quarantine because I've been in the US for about a week or so, had 5 days on the ground in Ohio, and I can absolutely assure everyone that there is normal after COVID. Life does go back to normal. I was actually out eating in restaurants and I was in meetings with people, real people, not remotely, but they were there. It felt like I remember this type experience. And it was kind of heartening and reassuring that, particularly for those of us who've been in Melbourne or Sydney or other locations where there's been lockdowns, that life will get back to normal at some point. So was there working with a client for about a week or so and then have done 2 weeks or entered my 2 weeks of hotel quarantine. And I wish I could complain about it, but I'm getting the chance to read, listen to podcasts, catch up on work, not have to look after the kids and do homeschooling. So I'm pretty good.
Get to fill the funnel, which I think is pretty essential for creativity, isn't it? Being able to read widely and take in new stimuli and just kind of top up, replenish the reserves, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I always say to people around creative thinking, one of the most important things to do is to keep the net wide, look for things that, are of slight interest to you and go deeper into those and find out what things are around. And, I'm a sucker for a bookshop. So, I came back from the US with an extra heavy case because I think I bought about 7 books, one of which is Dave Grohl's new book, Storyteller, which I'll recommend to you because that's awesome. But yeah, there's lots of ways to kind of fuel that creative fire. So keeping an interest across different topics and things is the way to go.
Yeah, I remember we had Andrew Sidwell recently on the podcast, and he was saying a very similar thing of, read widely and just kind of look into topics and areas that are just different to what you typically do. And I remember going, this is so at odds with how I am as a person, where if I find a song, it's like the only song I listen to. And if I find a meal, it's the only meal I want to eat. And I've got my black t-shirt on that I just want to wear all the time. But you can definitely feel the benefits of it, reading a blog on supply chain management or, watching a YouTube video on some sort of interesting food or something. It does feel like it gives you a bit of fuel to then draw from and just kind of expand maybe the way of thinking that we normally sort of would default to.
Yeah, mate, I completely agree with you. The only thing I'll just point out there is I think you're the only person in the world ever that has sounded excited about a blog about supply chain management. I think you're it.
Me, and any sort of logistics manager or person who works in that field, I'm sure. Hey, and trust me, it wasn't that good. I'm hoping it'll come in handy. Otherwise, it's 5 minutes of my life I certainly won't get back. But look, thanks for making the time, man. I really did enjoy the podcast we did last time, which the topic was how to sell an idea. And what was pretty cool about it was people do reach out a bit on LinkedIn after the episodes, and funnily enough, we actually have quite a few listeners from Ohio. So,
oh wow,
maybe a few from Hubbard Radio there. But one of the things that was really interesting, we played a snippet of it at the start of this episode, was you were talking around a brief uncovery interrogation technique all around the next 10 questions. And it was sort of a methodology more so than just here are the 10 questions that you want to ask. So as I guess a bit of a, not so much a methodology, but, as maybe a technique or a way of thinking, this whole idea of the next 10 questions, it feels a bit deeper. In your mind, what is the idea of the next 10 questions? What does it actually achieve beyond just extracting more detail?
For me, where I sort of landed on sort of branding it as the next 10 questions, in a different context, it's basically doing two things. One is, I think if you can demonstrate curiosity to a client or someone you're talking to, if you can demonstrate by asking questions that you actually care and you're interested, what it can help you with is both the short term and the long term. So the short term is you can extract some information that might be useful for the brief that you're working on or the campaign. Longer term, what it does is help build your reputation as being a curious person and representing the company or brand that you work for as being a curious brand. And when the shit hits the fan, which we've seen through COVID, what tends to happen is people go to trusted partners who they think are smart and get it, because you often think you're going to get either a more strategic solution, you're going to get a faster response. You don't kind of want to deal with the nufties. You want to deal with the people who, we've got this problem, we've never tackled it before, or there's this thing going on, or we're stuck. We need to get smart partners on board with this. And so by asking those sort of questions, I think the first thing it does is it builds credibility. That's the most important thing. But the second thing, which obviously is more related to the brief context, if you're in a briefing situation, you're asking those next 10 questions, is really the objective is to unearth unique information. Because what tends to happen is in the first 10 questions is you'll largely get maybe 75, 80% of the information that everyone else has got, because everyone else has asked the same questions. So people who ask all the important questions around the detail, which, is important, budget, demographic, competitors, campaign objectives, all that sort of table stake stuff. It's important, but you've got to think about it in a competitive situation is, unless you're being briefed on 100% exclusivity, or you're sitting down with a client and, you're the only one getting the brief, then everyone's getting the same information. And I always think that in order to try and uncover something unique, you need to go deeper and you need to ask broader or more lateral questions. And that's kind of the spit out for me, is that if you've got something unique, it gives you something else to leverage or work on when you take the brief back to the office. Is like, okay, well, we know all this stuff. Everyone got that information. But because we asked this question, we got this piece of information. Some of it will be useful. Some of it may not be useful, but you certainly won't know unless you ask.
I just love that. I mean, I just think that whole idea around differentiation in the solution you put forward, that different is better than better kind of mindset that we have sometimes, it has to come from being able to actually uncover something that only you maybe are uncovering. So, you can go back and sort of leverage that unique insight or that unique piece of information that your competitors don't have. What I think's happened in the last 18 months, is, at least from what I've observed, is there's a lot of focus on uncovery happening at the moment for BDS salespeople. They really are sort of going, we've got to mitigate the risk of coming back with the wrong thing. We've really got to make sure we do a good, solid client uncovery. What I worry about, though, is that a lot of these uncoveries are heavy on the detail questions. It's all about the budget, the timing, the demographic, the types of inventory we're going to be deploying. One, does that sort of feel like it's something that maybe you have observed across the last 18 months across a couple of industries? Or or, where people aren't sort of leaning into the creative kind of thinking or the creative questioning so much and are just going for the clinical detail? And if so, what do you think could be sort of driving that?
Obviously, we're in a bit of a time now where it's pretty hard to judge what's a trend and what is perhaps something that's going to just be a bit of a fad. The situation that we're in now is in such a weird kind of place because everything that is fundamental to selling, particularly in the media space, has had an opportunity to change in some way. We used to do a lot of stuff in person. Now we're doing a lot of stuff remotely. We used to get a lot of information through relationship building and client entertainment and lunches and all those sort of great things. And now it's very functional because you're on a Zoom at a certain time and you might be on the Zoom with 6 other people. And so those sort of things are changing. So I guess the first thing I would observe is that I don't think we can yet say what's here to stay and what's going to kind of revert back to normal. On that question, though, of questions or uncovery where people are just trying to seek that information, here's my kind of takeaway from that. Look at the word uncovery. Now, uncovery as a term that gets used a lot now is kind of become a placeholder word, but is that actually what's happening? Are you actually uncovering information? Or is someone just regurgitating what's on the brief to you? So there's a lot of regurgitation. There's a lot of like, okay, we've sent you this in an email, but now we're going to have a meeting and we're just going to verbalize what we put in the email. So, here's the demo. Well, that's what it says. Here's the budget. Well, that's what it says. So there's not really a lot of uncovery going on, I would say. The uncovery happens when you're actually asking questions, where you're uncovering information that you wouldn't have been presented anyway. And I'm glad to hear that the next 10 questions philosophy is resonating with people because that's where uncovery happens. It's very rare that you uncover anything massively interesting in the first 5 questions, particularly if the first couple are like, hi, how you going? What's news in your world? If you start to get to the actual brief and you're like, okay, tell us about it. It's not really uncovery. It's someone reporting. It's someone saying to you, here are those things. And I often think about this in the context of news gathering. There are reporters and there are journalists. Reporters take facts from somewhere else and just report it to you. Journalists unearth, uncover, go digging, go looking, ask questions, use sources, put multiple pieces together to form a story. And so maybe have a think about it in the context of next time you're taking a brief. Are you a reporter? Are you a journalist? Are you actually uncovering anything? And this trend around just getting factual information, again, I don't want to dismiss it because it is important, but think about things you would have been given anyway and then just move on to the next ones.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Like, you don't go to the Atlantic or the New Yorker or titles like that to hear the facts regurgitated. You go for the insight and you go for kind of the interpretation, the unique interpretation that reporter might have of the events and the things that are sort of being unearthed there. And I guess it's kind of, if we talk about sort of detail questions or the clinical questions of the brief, the ones we have to ask, right? Like the ones we have to actually know and we do have to go through the process. Have you got sort of any categories or ways of grouping different types of questions when it comes to sort of a good client uncovery? Do we have a detailed question versus like a background or history question versus like a future state question versus a real lateral question? Like, kind of curious if there's a way of naming those different types of questions and sort of maybe interchanging or using them in a way that makes it interesting for the client to actually answer them.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's good you said that about interesting for the client to answer them, because I always think a great question, you know when you've got it. It's hard to do, but you know when you've got it. Because traditionally the answer would be a client saying, you know what, no one's asked me that question. Or, you know what, I haven't actually thought about that. The question that sort of puts someone back on their heels might feel a little bit confrontational, or it might feel a little bit prickly, but you don't want to kind of be aggressive about it, but you want to be able to ask questions that get people thinking. And the way I would sort of group them or categorize them, as you said, is you're going to probably ask the mandatories or probably more the literal questions. So the literal questions are, you know, the who, what, where, when. Okay, so who are we targeting? What's the budget? What's the timing? All very literal. The lateral sort of questions come from a place that's unexpected and can come from things that seemingly aren't obvious or connected. I can flash back to times where I've been in briefings and I'm sitting there thinking about these questions, and I probably thought about it a little bit in advance, but I go in and go, well, what are the sort of the 3-5 questions that I've got up my sleeve that should the briefing session take us in a direction where it makes me feel comfortable to ask, I want to ask that question that really gets underneath something. And so, the surface level stuff is what we all trade in every single day. It's like, here's the basics. When you dig underneath, when you sort of start thinking a bit laterally, sometimes those questions, I call them whys questions, as in WHYSE, because the whys question means you're asking why to uncover something that's going to make you smarter. And if you think about it, the whole purpose of a media brief is to brief the media, right? But there's a reason why that media brief even exists, because someone in a marketing team has briefed an agency to achieve an outcome, and someone in the business that is being briefed out has briefed their own marketing team for that, and someone further up the chain has come up with a problem. So the more you ask why does this brief exist? Why does this brand have this problem? Why is this business going through this challenge? The more you kind of get to the heart of the issue, because briefs are effectively the symptoms, but the cause is way up the line. And you want to be able to say to people, okay, so we know that they're going to be marketing this product in, first quarter of next year. We know they've got this money to spend. So tell us what it means to the business that this product works. Tell us why it's important they're launching it now. Tell us what is keeping the CEO up at night. Tell us what's happened to the share price of the company. Tell us what competitive pressure they're on. And I think sometimes what I find a little frustrating is that if I say that to people, they go, we don't need to know that information. It's like, you don't know what you need to know. you don't, until you ask, you've got absolutely no right to say we don't need to know that. If you ask the question and you get a piece of information, you can then choose whether it's useful to your task or not, but it could also be really important background. To know that a business is launching a product and you have a media brief as the end result is just one outtake. If you take 6 steps back and you ask more questions, you get deeper into it, and you find out the reason they need to launch this product is because they're about to go through a merger process and they need their share price to look really good before that starts, and therefore they need a sales increase in the first quarter because that affects the share price, then all of a sudden you're kind of getting to the heart of the issue, and then you realize the importance of the question. You realize the importance of the brief. And if you're in media sales and you think your job is just to kind of get revenue, I think you're missing a really big opportunity to learn about how a business works through the mechanism of a brief. Use that as permission slip to say, okay, we've got this, but I'd really like to know what else is going on inside that business.
And, that whole thing around the whys questions is really interesting, because even just the actual why in place of what as a bit of muscle memory is amazing. It's amazing the actual difference that you can get. One of the examples I'd use is, what's the budget, right? So let's say that is the question. The reframe is why is this the budget? Why is this the budget you're giving us? Right. And obviously don't do it in an accusatory way or why aren't we getting more? But think about that. Why is that the budget for our channel?
Yeah.
Oh, because yours plays a critical role.
Well, absolutely. And, and that's, and like what you said there about not being an accusatory is a great example of you want, curiosity comes from the Latin to care. It's because you care, is you want to actually understand what's going on. You want to understand the whole picture. Remembering that, I reckon 90% of the time when you've got a media brief and you get a budget, that is not the only way they're trying to solve the business problem. It could be one of the ways, and a marketing campaign using paid media delivers on that. But, here's a great question when you get a budget. So let's say you get a budget for, 200 grand. You say, okay, so we've got a budget of 200 grand, but how much is it worth to the business to fix this problem? How much is it worth to the business to get a handle on it? What other resources are you aware of that the business is putting behind it? What you might learn is you're seeing a 200 grand media brief, but really the business is putting $5 million to solve that problem, which has gone into R&D of the product, has gone into testing, has gone into other paid media that you're not seeing, has gone into internal research, has gone into lots of different things. And if you just look at it as the prism of the 200 grand to achieve a campaign objective, you could be missing out on the 98% of money being spent by the business to solve the problem they're asking you to help solve.
Even the context, though, I think if it's, okay, we're not looking to influence the greatest share of the budget, but it's really interesting just unearthing, okay, it's a $5 million media investment that we're making here. It's like, wow, the stakes are pretty high. It sounds like this investment needs to be spent wisely. It sounds to me like there'd be a bit of unease or unrest on the parties who are entrusted to actually deploy that media investment. What do you need from us to make sure that that's not as much of a concern for you guys? How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah. What
do you need to prove back to your stakeholders? Like you can already see how you're just pulling a thread that actually allows you to kind of go down this completely different area. And I'll sort of admit, like, virtually, and in this sort of Zoom world, it's a little bit harder to kind of get into some of these questions because, I've said in previous episodes, like, the social contract isn't there, and the ability to actually observe body language and to pick up on those nonverbal cues isn't there. So there is a level of, like, people aren't as forthcoming or, aren't really willing to sort of share the way virtually that they maybe are in a face-to-face meeting.
It is a challenge of the time, but I would also say, like, I'm also not living in, this kind of weird utopia where, you ask a question, you expect people just to answer it. There's plenty of times where clients' tolerance for answering questions isn't there. It could simply be because they don't know. You're asking a question they don't know the answer to. It could simply be they don't have time and they don't want to give you that time dedicated to things that they themselves are thinking, this isn't relevant, so I'm not going to bother. It always reminds me of that great saying that comedians have, is that if the jokes aren't working, change the audience. It's about saying there's a reason why you're telling that joke and there's a reason why you think that's funny. So if you're not getting the right response, find someone who is. I could count hundreds of times where I've been in a situation where I'm in a briefing and I ask a question, someone doesn't know the answer. The follow-up question should always be, is there someone else I can contact to ask? And if it's an agency, they're usually pretty protective about the client.
Yeah.
But you kind of want to be respectful. But you also say, look, I'm really interested in this. And sometimes the ask is in Google. So the amount of people who take a brief and then go, well, I need to know the answer to that question. You'd be surprised if you start Googling anything about what the company's corporate PR releases are that they put on their website. You look at industry blogs and see how the company's being talked about. There's so many product review blogs. If you're dealing with a brief to do with a new product in any category, usually you can find someone who's been part of a test group or has some inside knowledge they're sharing. There's no excuse for not knowing. I think, the internet has now, thankfully, got rid of ignorance. If the only ignorance around is if we choose to allow it to happen, ignorance has been replaced, I think, by laziness. If you don't know something and you don't go looking for it or you don't go asking someone else for that information, then I hope to be the other salesperson who's going to do that because I'm going to beat you.
Yeah, I agree, mate. And I think you mentioned a point around client tolerance there for answering a lot of questions. I definitely think there is a dwindling amount of client tolerance to indulge, these longer sort of brief uncovery sessions, at least at the moment, right? And you're right, we're in a moment in time, and this is sort of a longer term conversation. But I kind of, my takeaway a lot of the time from that is, if you're in a really competitive marketplace, like if you're one of 5 or 6 suppliers or publishers who are all being briefed competitively, it is really just a case sometimes of them going, I don't necessarily want to spend 30 minutes with 6 different people from one particular channel. So the kind of challenge is, how do we make this process fun and exciting for them? What are some of the ways that you can kind of set that up and go, we just want to come in. There's a few things we'd love to ask you, but in going through this process, we think it'll be really worthwhile and time well spent for you for these reasons. Is there any way any techniques you can think of there?
Well, I would definitely call it out. I mean, I think that if you're going into a briefing, and let's pretend for a minute that it's not just a very stock standard buy. It's not like we're just chasing this amount of audience. We expect to hit these sort of reach goals. Here's the money. What can you deliver? It's not just a straight rate or commercial equation. Let's pretend for a minute that you've got a brief where there's some opportunity within the brief for creativity or some sort of, unique response that you can present on behalf of your organization that you work for. So what I would absolutely do is honor that word uncovery. I would start the conversation in saying, hey, listen, we know we've only got you for a short period of time. We know that time is really important. We trust that the information that you're going to provide in writing, either that you've already sent us or you're about to send us or you're about to show us, is going to cover off the basics. So how about we use that time a little bit differently and start an uncovery process around some of the things that we think either won't be in there or we'd like to kind of just explore because we think that could be interesting. So, question number one is not going to be, what's the budget? Question number one is going to be, do you know the history of how this product has come to fruition? You know, what's been the life cycle of developing this product? If it's an existing product, let's talk about, how sales have been to date. Let's talk about competitive pressure. Let's talk about, you know, what percentage of revenue this product is to the entire business. You know, find a place to start the conversation, which gives the indication to the other person that is giving the briefing that you actually are going to take it on a different tack, but you're not going to take up more of their time. I think if you start by, you know, doing the small talk and even over Zoom, and then you're spending 5-10 minutes on the basics that are pretty much in there anyway, think about it from the point of view of the person briefing. If they're briefing 6 people individually, they're just repeating themselves. Don't be the fifth repeat. Help them make it interesting and better. So call it out and say, hey, listen, we know you're sick of saying this sort of stuff, so let's just leave that to the detail. If there's anything we're not sure about, if we think there's a piece of detailed information missing, we'll follow that up in writing afterwards, once we've read the brief fully. But let's use this 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever, and we're just going to ask some questions that might appear to you that they're not exactly related, but they're really going to help us uncover and get to the heart of what the challenge could be, which allows us to present something unique to you.
Yeah, and you know, I think the thing about that language you're using there too, because I'm such a believer, and you've got to have client orientation in just the way you operate, right? Like anyone who goes into the room and they're asking questions about their format, their channel, their share of the budget, their product match, their, you know, what it is that they're going to think is right, and not actually casting their eye to the customer, the client first, and really being sort of seen to actually, or being genuinely, you know, inquisitive about the client and their challenge. It's always very, very kind of easy to detect that self-orientation, you know, and and that's where I think people don't like it, because it's like, why would I spend 20 minutes, you know, giving you, spoon feeding you a way to sell your product to me better? You know, that's not what we're here collectively to achieve. There was one thing that was interesting. I was just thinking about this because I had this vague memory that we spoke about John Mayer on the last podcast. Does that ring a bell?
No, I'll be honest with you and say it doesn't, but that's okay. I'm going to take your word for it.
I feel like you mentioned John Mayer, or maybe I mentioned him, but it's funny, you know, I remember watching he was in Nashville at the time that I was there, and I remember he got interviewed in a radio station, and this is a guy who would do interviews, you know, multiple times a day, just for months on end when he's on tour. And I can remember like listening to an interview he did, and he said to the interviewer, he goes, wow, you're a really good interviewer. He's like, you're asking really untrodden questions that are different and fun and exciting to answer. And it was one of those kind of light bulb moments for me where I was going, wouldn't that be amazing for a client to actually walk away from that uncovery and to really go, wow, that was really fun. You know, I really enjoyed that process.
Yeah. And that's where having empathy for the person giving the brief is really important. That if you're in a competitive media market, you're being briefed and you're not getting 100% share, then just pure maths says that other people are getting meetings as well. So if this person giving the briefs is doing 6 of these in a row, don't be the boring one. You know, for goodness sake, don't be the one that is just like everyone else. Because as I said at the top of this episode, there's 2 outcomes. One is to get the information, uncover something unique. So uncover, not just regurgitate, uncover unique information. But importantly, build credibility as being a curious person and as on behalf of a curious publisher or on behalf of a curious company. Because when times get tough, you'll be called on first. That's so that you play the long game with briefing. If you see the brief as just like a chance to convert the revenue on the table, you're missing a really big opportunity to build credibility and build a relationship based on asking great questions, being really curious, being good problem solvers, and coming up with unique solutions.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to kind of reinforce and highlight is I think sometimes people think asking questions or asking a lot of questions or being inquisitive, it's almost like, I don't want to let on that I don't know what's going on, or, this might reveal that I don't actually know as much as I'm pretending I should. And it's the complete opposite, isn't it? I mean, nobody is going to, if it's phrased the correct way and it's an interesting, provocative question, people like talking about themselves, and they like talking about the place they work. And, sometimes it can be really advantageous to not actually know a whole hell of a lot, but to be able to go in and sort of leverage that and go, hey, look, I don't know this space. What the hell does a CNC machinist do?
Yeah.
You got a job out here. What's that role? What do they do? That's interesting. I've never heard of that before in my life.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's actually a pretty good place to be from when it comes to actually trying to do a deep uncovery where you're pulling together a lot of rich information.
Yeah, absolutely. And, a great question starter or a great question opener is, tell me everything you know about this. Because what you want to do is you want to try and give that person an opportunity to share their knowledge. So in a sense, they are talking about themselves because they're talking about it in terms of their knowledge about the particular area. But you're also not setting them up for a fall. Like, sometimes if you ask questions and you go, oh, well, tell us why this is really important to, the business and how much of a revenue it is. There's a risk, of course, you make the other person feel a bit stupid if they don't know. So you want to give them a little bit of wriggle room. And so sometimes a more broadly asked question or broadly phrased question such as, tell me everything that you know, gives that person a chance to give you as much as they can, or as much as they're willing to, as opposed to really direct kind of like, what was the fourth quarter revenue of this product in 2017? It's like, well, I don't know, mate.
Compare and contrast this product to every other product in the market from 20 years ago to now.
Exactly. Yeah. So keep it broad, do it with empathy, but allow the person to shine. It is an exchange of ideas, an exchange of knowledge. So give that other person a chance to go, oh, I'm glad you asked that. Well, let's get on with that.
I really like that type of questioning technique there. Tell me everything you know. Are there any sort of questioning techniques, that give us like that maximum bang for buck? We say clients, like the tolerance to answer questions might be quite low. Maybe we want to go in and sort of pick our battles and go, okay, I'm only going to ask them 5 or 6 questions for this uncovery. But is there a way to make those 5 or 6 questions, to phrase them or to phrase one question in such a way that it kind of reveals and unearths multiple pieces of information, like those open-ended kind of techniques?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess this is where I sort of give you the number one hack that I do when I'm doing any sort of training with people around this stuff. And it's the simplest thing, yet no one does it. Well, they don't do it before I train them. They do it afterwards, but they don't do it naturally, which is write your questions down before you go. So there's an art of writing out questions that helps your brain get into gear, and it helps you, and I'm not saying type, I'm very clear in saying write. There's an art of getting your brain into gear to be able to explore things you never thought you'd ask. So if you don't prep and you just kind of go, oh, I've got this, I can ask questions on the spot, I get it. What tends to happen is that you'll just kind of wing it, and sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. When you're writing out questions, what tends to happen is you start, and this is why I talk about the first 10 and the next 10. You start with questions that begin with what, where, when, why. When you start getting further into it, you get more of the why questions. You get more of those things that go, why is that so? Why is that the case? Why are we getting briefed? Why is this happening? And I would say that there's the technique of writing them out helps you get to why quicker. And maybe, you don't have to worry about the next 10. Maybe you're getting there after question 6 or 7 or 8. But regardless of the number, you start again, literal, with those kind of factual type questions, what, where, when, who, but then you get into the why, and the why becomes really important. And that's, if you can start more questions with why and you're writing them down before you go, they're the only 2 things you need to do. If I was to boil every single thing I talk about in this space down to just that, it's write them out and start questions with why, and you will improve your ability to uncover unique information instantly.
And sometimes this kind of gets a bit controversial when I go down with certain questions like this one, but I want to sort of put it to you in context of what we're really fundamentally doing here. Obviously, it's from the goodness of our heart and we genuinely care about the client and their outcomes and we want to do better work. But we're also in a competitive marketplace, right? And we're also always looking for a way to give ourselves an edge or a competitive advantage over our competitors, particularly in these competitive brief situations. So you sort of said at the top of the episode, it's about uncovering pieces of information our competitors haven't, so we can go back with a more multi-dimensional sell and we can actually leverage and we can provide a more compelling sort of proposition. That's sort of, I guess, a good premise for me to ask the next question. Is there a way to put some subtle, not landmines for your competitors, but is there a way to sort of pre-swade the outcome? So if you do an uncovery, I'll give you an example. You're doing an uncovery with a client and you know your competitors really well and you've done a bit of red teaming and you think this is probably where, our biggest competitor is this is their strong suit. This is what they're going to do. They're probably going to play the brief this way and they're going to leverage these things. Is there a way to go in with your uncovery and with those next 10 questions and ask certain questions that lead the client down a path where they might think differently about the competitor if that's what they come back and do? Is there a way to sort of plant the seed and maybe undermine what a competitor might do on a response before they come back with it?
Yeah, I do. And look, let me just give you a shout out. That's a great question.
Thank you. It only took me 48 minutes to phrase it. So
well, but,
I appreciate
again,
that.
I mean, obviously, we do a little bit of prep for the podcast and that was a question that's taken me by surprise. And it's a great question. It's unexpected, but it's something that I'm thinking about now as you say it.
I'll give you an example, mate, before you answer, because I this is a real example. So I remember we went into a big partnership, annual negotiation, really high stakes. And we hadn't been on the contract for 2 years. And so, all the more kind of reason to really go in and have our uncovery really solid, because we obviously hadn't had the benefit of 2 years of partnership with this client. So we hadn't forged relationships. We hadn't uncovered unique information that somebody who was actually on the contract and was working with this client collaboratively over 2 years would be able to know. So we're already at a disadvantage. But one of the things that I had sort of been able to figure out was that there was a level of discontent on the client's end that they didn't really feel like a valued partner over the last 6 months. They didn't feel like this supplier was maybe treating them with the level of priority that they should, given their size. And so I went in knowing that piece of information a little bit beforehand. I had the client in the room with the agency. And in part of the uncovery, I remember asking a few questions that were deliberately just set to really fucking piss them off. And it was, hey, with the current sort of partnerships you have, what are some of the things that they've done in the last 3 or 4 months, as examples that you guys really appreciate so we can understand what it is you value, something like that. And it was just totally designed for them to go, oh, they actually haven't done anything for us. And I don't know, like I kind of walked out of that room going, I feel like I've really set up that pitch perfectly.
I get what you mean. I mean, look, it's a good example there because I think there's a subtle line between depositioning a competitor, using the opportunity to perhaps put a spotlight on something that you want the client or the person making the decision to have a high awareness of, and kind of, wargaming kind of, like we're going to try and throw a grenade at the other guys sort of thing.
Yeah.
And, when I first heard the question, what I thought you were kind of asking was along those sort of lines. When I hear that example, I think it's a bit more around the subtle depositioning is that how can you use an opportunity where you're in the room to potentially highlight a competitor's weakness through questions?
I think the deposition, so that was a really extreme example. That was kind of, I wouldn't say it was a desperate one, but it's not a technique I would normally use were it not for the fact that it was a 2-year contract, and there was a lot of eyes on the business on it. But I think the depositioning is absolutely normally where I would go. It's being able to kind of think about what are some of the things that your competitors would potentially want to position and put in a better light. But through your uncovery, you can almost step a client through a process whereby they start to come around to a different way of thinking that's more aligned to what you provide.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So it's sort of more, it's a little bit softer, a little bit of a less aggressive technique.
Yeah, and look,
say.
I mean, I think I've always been, and look, this is just reflective of my experience, but I've always been in an environment where CEOs I've worked for or heads of sales I've worked for have been far more about sort of run your own race. And that's not, I'm not contrasting that with your experience. I'm just saying in terms of how I approach this is that there's been probably, I wasn't in the Austereo of the 90s or any of those places that are famous for their kind of tactics. But I have been in environments where, there's an encouragement to kind of focus on your own stuff. But there's certainly been times where I've used an opportunity where I thought we might be on the back foot. Or we're up against it, And look, I think of times where I used to work at Nova when we're up against Hamish and Andy, for example. When you'd know that, oh gosh, SCA is going to roll out Hamish and Andy, they're going to win this money. And look, and by many times they just did. So I'd be thinking, all right, so I wouldn't go in and so basically what you do is know your own strengths, know your own weaknesses. So I wouldn't be rolling in saying, oh, has the client heard our drive show? They're really good. I'd probably be thinking like, if SCA can't give you Hamish and Andy, where does that leave them? I'd be kind of poking it with like a bit more of a, we kind of want to give you the idea that we think we know what the other guys are coming back with. What happens if they can't do that for any reason? Maybe they're too expensive or maybe they're sold out or maybe there's something going on. And usually I guess that would be reliant on you being in a situation where you felt like, you're on the back foot. And so it becomes about opening up a dialogue or a possibility. Is like, what happens if the other guys can't give you all the Christmas presents that you want? What does that mean? More to probably plant a seed of not doubt, but like try and open up a window to kind of explore, because then what that might lead is someone to say, oh, well, if we can't do that, then we'd probably be looking at, like in a radio context, we wouldn't look at drive, we'd look at breakfast. And so you go, oh, okay, good. That's a good little piece of information I wouldn't have got if I hadn't have raised Hamish and Andy.
The Hamish and Andy is such a good example because that's
real. I remember, you'd sometimes go to briefings going, this is ridiculous. They're going to buy Hamish and Andy. What are we even going to this for? But, you can talk, and you know what? You can talk yourself into that sort of stuff.
Rightfully so too. Like, that was one of the issues was that even at competitors, you actually rightfully acknowledge just how good, it was a once in a generation type of show. But I can remember with Hamish and Andy, I similar to your point, I would definitely kind of use the uncovery as a way to maybe deposition them, if I could. One of the things that I think with Hamish and Andy, or in any type of situation where you have such a standout market leader, like you're doing an uncovery with a client, and there is that sort of that big juggernaut that you just go, they're going to scoop up the money. Sometimes, like the things that can really work are going in and saying, we know that there's a lot of brands in your category that really favor just those in default environments. They go and buy that big national number one show, and that's shit, because then suddenly you're in this cluttered category of all your competitors, and like that again, it's not set up as part of the sell. It's actually part of the uncovery before you've even put your solution forward. But if nothing else, you can kind of see and gauge their reaction in the room and go, are they nodding along? Are they subscribing to this type of thinking?
Yeah.
And if so, let's kind of push a little bit more down that line, and let's kind of show a differentiation strategy we've got here.
Yeah.
So that's a fantastic example, Hamish and Andy. I think, it's probably one of the best is like going into the room knowing that you actually are already on the back foot in many cases.
It swings and roundabouts in media, right? There's no finish line. So at some stages you're working for the guys that have got the best properties in town, and some stage you're working for the guys that don't have the best properties in town. That's how it rolls. And sometimes it's longer term, sometimes it's kind of changes year on year. But I think if I was to come up with a template to kind of answer that question, I'd be saying, if you can't get what you want from someone else, what does that mean in terms of the response? So it's kind of like, you're kind of you're trying to get an inside information or leaving the door ajar to acknowledging that probably they're going to go in another direction for a majority of share or whatever it is. And probably that's going to way it plays out. But you want to not find that out the hard way of getting the phone call at the end to say, sorry, you missed out. You want to kind of put it up front and say, look, we can all read the room. We know we're not silly. We know this is the way it's going to go. But if that doesn't happen, what's your plan B? And how much do we feature in that? Because what you might find is someone might just give you that little bit of information that says, oh, we haven't thought about that. Or, yeah, actually, if we can't, then we would just forget the channel altogether and go somewhere else. Or we'd need to find, publishers that are willing to partner up, or whatever that looks like. But it's just something. It's something. And to me, it's probably less about depositioning a competitor, more about acknowledging the reality and trying to still find a way to find a win.
And are there sometimes, going that step a bit further there, like, can you be as candid, do you think, sometimes in the uncovery, where you can just ask a question and go like, hey, do you have any concerns, or do you think there's anything from our end that's going to be a real challenge for us here? Is there anything that you might be concerned about our ability to execute or deliver on, or like even kind of really asking for the objections up front?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's anything, again, this kind of goes to the path of asking, it's an uncovery. Ask questions that are going to uncover information. If you want to spend your time asking the questions you're going to get answers to in writing, then knock yourself out. But I'll be the other guy that comes in after you, and I'll uncover information, and I'll say things like, tell us what our biggest weakness is. Like, what's the biggest risk that we pose for you? Are there areas that you're not sure about that we could perform in? Do you trust us to deliver the results? I mean, they're all kind of saying the same things in different words, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, sometimes I feel like, we know it's show business, but we put on a bit of a show in these situations. We're kind of like, I'm always worried about the salespeople who are like worried about what they look like, and worried about, whether the presentation's going to work, and worried about the PowerPoint and all this stuff. Like, yeah, of course I get it. It's fair enough you worry about that stuff. What would be really good is just to be yourself and go in there and show that you've got the maturity and intelligence to read the room. And the room is, you're probably only going to end up with 30%. You're not going to get a majority share. Maybe up front that you've got budget pressures and you have to kind of deliver more than what you're getting briefed on. But calling it out and saying, listen, if is the maximum we can do is this. If so, is there anything else we could do that could potentially change that? Or is there anything a competitor would do that might cause you to look at us more favourably than you already do? Or because we fucked up that campaign from 6 months ago, are you still angry at us? And, calling out those things. I think being real is such an underrated opportunity in media sales. We pride ourselves on being a bit no bullshit, and particularly in Australian media, I think we kind of like to think we cut to the chase, but you still see the performance art going on. And I just think sometimes there's a great card to play if you're the most real, you're the most authentic, you're the meeting out of 20 that person's had today that they enjoyed and had a good conversation and was the most real and transparent and productive. Like, be that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree, mate. And I think, I've said this on many occasions, but you come across bad salespeople in so many walks of life. And that's why I think the struggle we have in media sales often to legitimize our profession is that people just kind of lump sales into this one bucket of, the aftermarket car salesperson who's just, follows a script and just doesn't give a rat's ass about you. And I think you're right. I think it's like, you got to swing the complete other way, and you've got to kind of, particularly in a competitive channel, you've got to be the one bringing value with every interaction beyond product and price, which is kind of, okay, so my last question for you before we jump into our listener question, and you are the founder of a company called The Ideas Business, so I don't mind throwing something that breaks your creative, that gets you to flex your creative chops here, but let's say you only have 3 questions, right? I said, Wade, I've got no time, you can literally ask me questions. I've got 5 minutes. So you've only got 3 questions, and you want to uncover and unlock as much gold as possible, beyond the clinical details of the brief, which you've already got. What might those 3 questions be, or what might they sort of look like?
Well, the first question is, why are you being such an arsehole?
Why are you being a dickhead? Yeah.
Okay. So, 3 questions. Oh, look, this goes back to that philosophy of uncover, not just ask questions. So let me assume, for the sake of this argument, that I know that I'm going to get the information that is the tin tacks of the brief and the relevant information around budget and demo and all that. I'm going to get it. So I would probably start with, tell us why this is important. Tell us why this brief's important. That kind of language, or, tell us how important it is, or something around the importance of what it is, because what you're going to be able to read from that answer is this the biggest thing they're doing this year, even though they haven't told us that yet? Is this the biggest they've spent in a while, even though they haven't told us? Or is this just like, something they do every 6 weeks and we just happen to have got the break this time? It gives you a perspective so you can start joining the puzzle pieces together. So when you go back to the office, you can go, right, this is, we're going to be really big on this because, or guys, this is just it sounds big, but it's actually this or whatever. So it's something to help you set the scene yourself. So something around, why is this important? Number 2, what will make you look good? Everyone's working for someone else, right? So unless you're being briefed by the actual business owner who's paying you the bill, the CEO, or if it's their own business, they're working for someone else. So if you say what will make you look good, it's kind of getting a window into the kind of thing that they need to present back up the line to someone else. So if it's an agency, what's going to make you look good to the client? If it's a client direct, what's going to make you look good to your boss? What do you need to see in here? It's kind of a between the lines question. Like, we'll come up with our best stuff, sure, but what do you need in here? And for some people, it can be quite functional. Some people will say, what would make me look good is if you just present it back in this format. That'll make me look good, because it saves me the work of having to recut it and redo it. What would make me look good is if you include as much value as possible. What would make me look good is that if we get this campaign right, then we're going to get briefed on another 6. Whatever their answer is, and some people might not want to give it to you, but I'm playing the role of what questions will I ask. That's certainly one of them. So why is this important? What will make you look good? And I think the third one I'd say is, and this is borrowed from the classic job interview question. What's something I haven't asked that you think will help me? Like, when they sort of train you in job interviewing, it's like, what's something I should be asking? What's something I need to know? Because it demonstrates a level of intellect around and curiosity around what's actually going on here. The transaction we're making is, in the context of a job interview, is that I want the job, I want you to give it to me, so help me, right? The context of the briefing and media sales is I want to win this brief, I want to get the revenue, help me. And so by saying what's something I haven't asked that you think will help, you're actually recruiting them onto your team. Like, they may be reluctant to kind of give away the farm, but they might give you a little tidbit. They might say, well, you know what? The guy before you, he asked about this and I thought that was really interesting. So, why don't you sort of think about that? Or they might say, listen, you've just completely skipped over this bit, which is really important. We were waiting for you to ask it and you didn't. And so you don't leave the room going, oh, damn it, we didn't get that. That's probably the third one. What's something I haven't asked that you think will help me out?
Mate, how good. Those 3 were awesome. That was
not bad, eh?
That was very,
hey,
very
I should
well
call
done.
out too. I say guys a lot. Obviously, I mean the collective guys and girls, just in case you get any letters.
No. I make a point of clarifying that too, actually. We do actually have a listener question from a guy who is a guy.
Okay.
Who recorded this for us. So I'm going to flick over to it and I'd be keen to hear your thoughts on it.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
I'm a big believer in really good client discovery and going deep into the detail. But one of the things that I struggle with is briefing internal teams who are supporting me with crafting the solution. So do you have any tips for how to distill a detailed client discovery into the key nuggets for different internal teams?
Oh, that's a great question. Look, it is a challenging one. I think sometimes that at the moment, it's, depending where you are, it's remote, it's on Zoom, whatever. So you might have internal people more on the calls than if you had to traipse into an agency and come back with the brief detail. But let's just kind of put it into a bit of a real world context. So let's say you're the only one that gets the brief and then you need to go and brief others about it or tell people about it to get them to do something, right? So I think one of the most underestimated opportunities is the minute you've got the information, you are in selling mode. So you sometimes think that you're like, okay, I've got to take this back and I've got to debrief and then we'll kind of build a response and then we'll go back and pitch it. And you think the pitch is where the sell starts. The sell starts when you literally have finished the briefing, you hang up from it or you leave the building or wherever you go, and the next person you interact, you're starting to sell that brief to them. And so I think about how you are selling, your demeanor, your presentation style. If you are saying, hey guys, we've got a really awesome brief and it's a heap of shit, don't try and kind of wash that stuff over. Be real, be authentic and sell it to them in a way that is real. It's like, you know what? We've got a great opportunity to do this. It may not have the best detail or it may have a lot of information, but the reality is, we need to work on this, and you've got to, you at that point, you're the coach of the team. You've got to get the team up and about to try and do the best possible work. And no one wants to do great work on something that you announce as a bad brief when you take it back to the office. So, start selling is number one. Number two is distilling the information down. I think there's something to be said for that kind of thought around, we get so used to the media and media language and the media world. And, when you try and talk to people outside of media and they ask you what you do, and it's really hard to explain sometimes. Yeah. I would say that the more you can kind of put it in the key points that someone outside of media would understand, the clearer it's going to be. So, let's say you've got this really detailed brief. Let me just make up a client. It's from Mazda. The Mazda sedan is being launched next year, and it's got all this, highfalutin technology, and it's targeting soccer mums with 2 kids under 5, and all like blah, 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 all this detail. Basically, what you want to do is you want to distill that into something really actionable really quickly. You want to be able to say, okay, the objective of this brief is to get Trudy from Carindale to get excited and go and buy one of these things. So there's some information I've got that will support that in terms of her habits, in terms of what she likes to do, in terms of things she likes to buy, in terms of her perception of Mazda. But let's just start with that. That's kind of the key piece of information. The job of this brief is to get Trudy in a Mazda. Right. Now let's work to the next layer of detail. The Mazda comes out in January. We need to get something, out in market for them in December. We need to be thinking about the fact that it's Christmas time and she's got a lot of things on her mind. She's not going to be thinking about buying a car, but we want to put it in front of her anyway. And so what we want to be able to do is come up with a compelling activation, idea, campaign, promotion, whatever, that helps get that Mazda into her mind. And so what I've done is kind of just characterize the brief. I've got there's heaps of detail that will come. And there's important information about stuff that we need to know. But to translate that information to someone else, think like you're telling someone outside of media. Is that what my job here is to try and get people to buy cars, mum. Like use the mum filter. It's like, what do you do all day, dear? Oh, well, I'm advertising and media. Yeah, what does that actually mean? Mum, I'm trying to get people to buy cars by getting Mazda to buy ads on the radio or buy billboards or whatever you're selling. So I would be just thinking about the characterization. So your attitude, the demeanor, how you're selling it back to people in the team is important. But the characterization of the brief, think real person, think colloquial language. You can follow that up with detail, and you will need to follow that with detail through the process. But the first steps, if the question's around how do you get people excited, I think you've got to, or give that information. I think you've got to characterize it and present it in a authentic and positive manner, like you're selling it to them as well.
The thing you said there, I know when you were at SCA, you had that whole case, the challenge approach solution, execution type of framework. But I remember Julian Cole, who has the Planning Dirty newsletter, he shares some really cracking stuff on LinkedIn, and he actually had something, I should probably put a link to it in the show notes, which was very much what you were saying. It was taking a really complex brief, and the example he used was, we find that, someone like myself, who's a new father, fitness and health kind of falls by the wayside because work is, a big demand, and, work puts big demands on your time, as does family life. And you can kind of go into, he's a professional and he lives here, and, our challenge is to engage him and talk to him about this great health product. But I remember he sort of wrote it in these 3 examples of writing it in really matter-of-fact basic language, which was really clever. It was like, dads who've, dropped dumbbells, dads who pick up their kids instead of the dumbbells on the weekend, or stressed out corporate dads who can't work out when to work out. It was just this really, really cool way of articulating exactly who the consumer was and exactly what their problem was. in a way that was super easy to grab. And then you're right, like the complexity and the detail and the execution and all that stuff can sit behind it. But at its core, even be able to pitch that back to the client and kind of go, our challenge on this, as we deem it, from a phenomenal uncovery, we've taken all of that and we've distilled it into kind of this nice log line, which is this.
Yep.
Do you agree?
Yep.
Sweet.
Yep, absolutely. And look, and that is absolutely a skill. Like it's very much easier said than done. So what I would say to people who want to get better at doing that, at being able to characterize brief, is find someone in the team who you work with and work with them and get them to help you get better at that. If you feel like, yeah, I get it in philosophically, I understand what you're trying to say, but to do that is really hard. The way to get better at that is to work with someone who you think does that really well. So in every environment in media, there's someone who's a really clear, crisp communicator of really everyday language. Sit down with them and give them the acknowledgement that that's who they are. I recognize you're this person. You can do this stuff really well. Can you help me with some stuff? So think of it like almost handing in your homework. I'm going to try and characterize this brief. I want you to tell me if I've done this. You read the brief and then you tell me if I've got this right. Give me some words that help. Give me some ways to do it. And you do get better by doing. It is a skill that you can absolutely learn, but I wouldn't get too worried, particularly the person who wrote the question in, is that, how you to get people excited internally is it's not going to happen straight away. But if you start down the path of realizing that you're pitching it back into the team, not inauthentically, don't say a bad brief is a good brief because we can all see it. But your attitude, your demeanor, how you're going to go after it, you're the coach of the team, and get that language as plain and simple as possible are probably the things that are going to help you the most.
Mate, I reckon that's an awesome answer to that question. And if you don't have that person in your business who can help you, reach out to my good friend Wade Kingsley and the Ideas Business, and I'm sure you'll be able to help as well. For a nominal fee. That's actually the end of the ep, mate. Thanks for your time. Before I let you go, I do want some plugs. What's the World of Ideas Business offer for all these media sales people and these media organizations out there? Do you have digital courses? Do you offer Zoom mentoring sessions? Are you doing more in-person stuff? What's the next 12 months going to kind of look like from the Ideas Business, and how do people who want more Wade Kingsley get more of it?
Well, first of all, my collab with John Mayer is coming out next week, so I should give that a plug. No, I honestly don't know where John Mayer came from, but we'll just leave it there. I would love people to have a look at the online learning course I've developed called Creative Champions. Yep. It's at creativechampions.co. And on there, I've developed an online course that you can just do 10 minutes of creative fitness a day for 21 days. And that really starts helping you with curiosity, which I know has been the topic of our conversation today. But there's two other kind of really important things in creative fitness, as I call it, creative strength. Building that creative muscle is the ability to make connections between things, find those patterns between things in an original way, and the courage to kind of get out there and share your ideas with the world, whether that's selling them to clients or just trying to get your next door neighbour to buy some cakes that you've made. Whatever it is there's an element of courage that goes with creativity. And in the online learning program, Creative Champions, what I've tried to do is take all of the things that I've learnt over my time from lots of other really smart people and added my own perspective and put them into this online course. So it's creativechampions.co.
I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes, and would definitely encourage people to go and check that out. And if you do get an opportunity in the next kind of 3 to 6 months to start doing more in-person kind of presentations, or if you do launch anything else, let me know, Wade. I'll definitely kind of on future episodes just flag what's going on and give you a plug. Really appreciate you making the time, mate. Is there sort of any parting thought on this topic that you sort of want to leave the audience with? Like sort of maybe one thing we could wrap this up with, which is like, if you take nothing else from this other than the John Mayer through line, what would be
let me give you I'll leave you with another pop culture reference. So I'm a big fan of Ted Lasso. You've been into Ted Lasso?
No, but everyone I know tells me I'd love it. With Jason Sudeikis, is that the one?
Absolutely. It's on Apple TV Plus. So if you don't have Apple TV Plus, it's worth signing up just for the, free trial period so you can binge the first 2 seasons. So Ted Lasso is a soccer coach. He's he's a US guy, but he's gone to the UK to be a soccer coach, and he knows nothing about soccer. his background was American football. Long sort of bow to draw, but, you know, when you watch the show, you see the reason he's there. It's not a show about soccer. It's a show about life. And that sounds cliche, but it's absolutely true. So there's one phrase that sticks in my mind that relates to the topic we've talked about that has come up in a Ted Lasso episode to date. And there's a scenario where Ted Lasso is in a bar and there's a guy who thinks he's really good, thinks he's better than Ted. And he challenges Ted to a game of darts. And so this guy thinks Ted's got no hope. He's going to beat him by miles. So he's throwing darts at the dartboard, and he basically has made an assumption that Ted is not good because he's from America. He wouldn't know about darts. And Ted comes up to the dartboard and he throws his first dart and it kind of lands right in the middle. Throws his second dart, lands right in the middle. You know, he just absolutely blows this guy away. And Ted says back to him that he knows in life it's really important to be curious and not judgmental. And I think there's something about that message, to be curious and not judgmental, means that if you enter as many situations as possible in your life, whether it be in media sales or in a broader life perspective, where you're open to possibility, where you're open to asking questions, where you're open to being curious and not predetermining an outcome, you just never know what will happen.
Wow, that is a fantastic final note to part on. And I'm going to go binge that show right now after Succession episode 1, season 3, which kicks off tomorrow night too. So, yeah, mate, thanks, man. I really always just love having chats to you. It's very, very enlightening every time we do, and the audience seem to think so as well. We've got some great downloads on your previous ep, and no doubt this one will sort of quench the thirst of a few people who wanted more on the next 10 questions. So, Wade Kingsley, enjoy the rest of your hotel quarantine down there in SA, mate, and we look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Jamie. It's always good to talk to you, and I always think that your body is a wonderland. I couldn't think of another John Mayer song.
You've been listening to Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. Head to MediaSalesMastery.com to help pick the topic, guide the show, and don't forget to subscribe to receive new episodes each week.